As organizational leaders, working professionals, and members of a multicultural, multi-generational world, there is a lot of talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and the why behind it. But what do these terms even mean? What does doing this work meaningfully entail? What are the foundational building blocks to understanding, navigating, and leading DEI in our own workplaces and our own communities? To understand, embrace, and activate the what, the why, and the how of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is essential to acknowledge the biases that we hold and that we understand how they might impact our experiences with and our assumptions of other people. I'm Raven Solomon, founder and CEO of Raven Solomon Enterprises, your trusted diversity, equity, and inclusion education and consulting firm. As you embark on your journey of being an inclusive individual or an inclusive leader, I invite and challenge you to approach the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion through our simple framework, the 6 building blocks of DEI. The third building block of DEI is about acknowledging and understanding bias. Understanding and acknowledging bias is essential for fostering equity, inclusivity, and even for rational decision-making in both personal and societal contexts. As advocates of DEI and as inclusive individuals, we are responsible for acknowledging our biases and actively working against letting them inform our choices and our behaviors, as that can potentially create harm for others. Here's the thing, simply put, bias is a preference in favor of or against a thing, a person, or a group compared with another. The word preference is important here. By holding a preference, we favor something over another thing. Preferences can be harmless. For example, I can prefer the mountains over the beach. Don't judge me. I can prefer a large lunch versus a large dinner. I actually like both. Biases can be negative or positive in this sense. But to have a positive bias about someone else based on their identities is not necessarily a positive thing. Even a bias that is conscious, that might seem positive, even something like believing salespeople should be extroverted, or favoring a job candidate with more formal education, may have negative impacts. Biases are not necessarily good or bad, right or wrong. What's important is that we identify when a bias is at play, and if it has negative consequences, we can address it. If it doesn't, perhaps we don't. Our biases are informed by a myriad of influences. For example, our experiences. Our experiences greatly shape our biases. We learn lessons from good and bad experiences alike. We learn to prefer some things over others as we move throughout our lives. Another source of our biases can be our news feeds, both formally and informally. These are the sources of the information that we receive, whether it's news articles, social media posts, books, movies, or television shows that we watch. What we hear, what we listen to, and what we read influences our beliefs, our opinions, and our biases. Another source of our own biases can be our education. Our education can be both formal and informal, but they both shape our biases. The schools we attend, the subjects we study, all affect our preferences. For example, if we've completed higher education, sometimes we treat people who have similar levels of education with respect and value their contributions, while we may more easily disregard those who haven't received the same education. Another source of our bias can be our background or our social context. Our backgrounds shape our biases, where we grow up, where we live along the way, what we do, who we spend time with, what religion we follow, etc. Another source, our culture. Our culture shapes our biases. The rules, spoken and unspoken, of our societies determine how we are expected to behave, and they inform what we determine to be normal. Another source, our identifiers. Innate characteristics. These identifiers shape our biases as they often inform our experiences with others. These identifiers can include things like race, gender identity, ethnicity, etc. When taken together, all of these things, our experiences, our news feeds, our education, our background, our cultures, our identifiers, all can cause us to have our own set of individual biases, both conscious and unconscious, which in turn influence our behavior and the decisions that we make. There are two main types of biases. There's conscious or explicit bias, and there's implicit or unconscious bias. Conscious bias is expressed directly, and it's something that we're super aware of. We can explain it, we can do something about a conscious bias relatively easily if we choose, because we know it's there. An unconscious bias or implicit bias, on the other hand, is expressed indirectly. It is an innate belief of ours that we might not necessarily even be completely aware of. Unconscious bias is something we don't consciously think about, hence the name. It usually shows up in what we do rather than what we say. If we do express it, we are often vague. Oh, I don't think she'd be a good fit for our team. Or, we don't have time to talk about alternatives. Unconscious biases trigger us to act in the sense that we might understand them to be instincts. Sometimes they're helpful. For example, if I walk alone at night and I pass by a dark alleyway, I might cross over to the other side of the street where the light is without thinking about it. I've got a feeling that the dark alley perhaps is not safe. I just cross the road instinctively. That's my unconscious telling me to do a certain thing. A few common biases, both explicit and implicit, might include confirmation bias, or the seeking or interpreting of information that is partial to our existing beliefs. Another might be in-group bias, which is simply our tendency to favor members of in-groups and neglect members, perhaps, of out-groups. Another could be sunk cost bias. That is our tendency to maintain certain beliefs or behaviors because of vested resources, time, energy, etc. Last one, this is a big one, similarity attraction bias. That is our tendency to more easily and deeply connect with people who look and feel like we do. All of these different types of biases can have consequentially monumental impacts. Our brains automatically generate narratives and images for us based on what we're used to seeing, what we're used to hearing, perhaps what we've been taught. Bias doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. But it is also important to note that our biases really present an opportunity for us to do true harm to others, our communities, and our societies, especially when we're not aware of them. When discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion in society, culture, and in the workplace, we often hear that representation matters. Seeing our identifiers appropriately reflected in society is the foundation of representation. Having a version of ourselves depicted in society affects how we think of ourselves and how other groups think of us and engage with us. Appropriate and avid representation of historically marginalized and underserved groups helps us to mitigate bias. Aside from advocating for equal representation across media platforms and social systems, etc., we can all work internally to rumble with bias, as I like to call it. When we confront or rumble with our own biases, we can do a few things. We can all commit to leaning in to the vulnerability of not just having bias, but identifying it and calling it by name within yourself and within others. Further, it is crucial to stay curious and generous with yourself and with others. Moreover, it is essential to accept the messy middle of not having a definitive end to the work of being an inclusive individual. Understanding it is a day-by-day, bit-by-bit thing. Rumbling with our bias is a continuous process of unlearning and relearning all over again. Finally, I encourage you to seek intercultural engagement with those who are different from you, and to diversify what I call your news feeds, the sources of the information you digest, you consume. Lean in to the courage it takes to reflect and grow when addressing your own biases head on. Acknowledging, addressing, and rumbling with your implicit and explicit biases really allows you to become a better ally and champion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. As the third of the 6 building blocks of DEI, understanding bias is key to being an inclusive individual and an inclusive leader. Understanding the 6 building blocks of DEI allows us to reimagine the role we all play in achieving equity and fostering inclusion. Both individual behavior and systemic change will create the world in which we hope to both live in and leave for future generations to come. I hope you will join me in continuing to learn about these 6 building blocks of diversity, equity, and inclusion as we uncover the what, the why, and the how of this work, discovering, embracing, and activating DEI.